All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Amundsen, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA Indo-PACOM speaker session entitled Semiconductors, China, Taiwan, and the U.S. Policy Debate, Intersecting Technological, Economic Security, and Geopolitical Realities. I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Richard Cronin, for taking the time to speak with us today. Before we get started, though, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll have a Q&A session at the conclusion of our speaker's presentation. So during his brief or during the Q&A, go ahead and submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Ms. Mariah Yeager. Her name is going to be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager, and questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed. So please send those questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. So if you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. Lastly, please keep your video and audio off for the duration of this event if you're in our audience so that we can keep bandwidth strong for our speaker. So now I'm going to introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to him. Dr. Richard Cronin is a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. At Stimson, he works on transboundary and non-traditional security issues involving China and Southeast Asia from the perspective of political economy. Dr. Cronin has researched, lectured, and taught Asian political economy and US-Asia security issues in Singapore and Japan's Cho University, and shorter courses in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and Viet Le, Laos. Most recently, he is the author of a Stimson Center issue brief entitled Semiconductors and Taiwan's Silicon Shield, which is the topic that he's going to focus on today. So Dr. Cronin, the floor is now yours, and here are your slides.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the fact that NSI was I think the first contact I had to really appreciate the significance of this topic, and I'm grateful in particular to Eric Kuznar. I don't know if Eric is on the program or not in the audience, but for doing a peer review, a very helpful peer review of a late draft, and for pointing out to me the significance of strategic industries in a globalized world, and particularly Taiwan's, the importance to Taiwan of being a secure strategic industry, having a strategic industry that it gives it leverage, and we'll talk about that some more. Thank you. Next. Or am I doing it? Okay. So again, strategic semiconductors as a strategic industry. These are the most complex tools, if you will, technology ever devised by humankind, and I still. And actually, probably technologically much more so than for instance, the nuclear weapons or the atom bomb. But it also, what's different from like the atom bomb or other security related technologies is that it functions in the industry functions in a unique global ecosystem of at least 20 or more countries, and hundreds, even thousands of suppliers and around the world. And it's the brains of our economic future. If we think about the Chinese, for instance, China's challenge on things like AI and 5G, technology, or automated vehicles in the future. All these things depend on ever better, ever more advanced chips, and technologically, it's the sort of a coin of the realm. I mean, China wants to. Xi Jinping would like to. More like wants to may have China become a peer of the United States technologically, by 2049, but it's it's not sure they can get there for reasons that we'll go into in the presentation. And finally, this the industry requires an enormous capital investment in a large and well-trained workforce. Thank you. Next. So I talk about semiconductors and the sort of a new U.S., China, Taiwan nexus. The old nexus was much more political and traditionally strategic. This has changed to the point that the U.S.-China partnership now is a key to geopolitical balance, peace, and stability in Asia. And TSML, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is the exclusive contractor for all of the U.S. companies' chip designs for leading edge chips, especially. And China depends on Taiwan for 70% of its semiconductor needs, and Taiwan's domination of global semiconductor fabrication reinforces its traditional strategic status. Sorry about that. And it's but here's what's really important. It's no longer about Taiwan itself, which for so long was, well, Taiwan's democracy, its independence, its strategic location. But it's much more. It's much more than that. It's about the peace and stability and the U.S. Leadership of the Asia Pacific order. Thank you. Next. So I alluded this already, but the U.S. debate on China is really stovepiped, and I won't read all these points to you, but the idea of strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity, that's no longer relevant. And the president, Biden, who's been always comes along with the phrase faux pas, frequent faux pas, susceptible, has been saying in answer to press conference questions, etc., and in several forums now, that on the one hand, we still believe in the idea of the one China and support that, but on the other hand, with regard to our willingness or intent to come to Taiwan's assistance in an emergency, in a Chinese attack, he's made clear it's not really about Taiwan as Taiwan. It's about the whole peace and stability of the region. So so automatically any Chinese attack on Taiwan is a war, and it would not only involve the U.S., but for reasons that I may be able to get to, it would include Japan and other allies as well. All right, next, please. So just briefly, this issue of Taiwan's strategic importance. This is the traditional strategic importance, which is geographic, and a couple points to mention are: one, China is not advantaged in terms of its geography. So the coast of China, the main, most populated, most industrialized coast of China, opposite Taiwan, has very shallow water, and the Chinese Navy can actually only get out to the Philippine Sea and the Pacific Ocean through one of two choke points. One is the Miyako Strait, and the other is the forgot in the south of Taiwan, Bashir Channel. But you can see how close Taiwan is to Japan and the Japanese islands, which really, here's Okinawa. They reach very down close to Taiwan, and that means that for China to use the Miyako Strait to exit in a conflict, they would have to go through Japanese controlled territory, and that's the Japanese now recognize that as a reality that they have to address, and they are addressing it by, among other things, building rebuilding two helicopter carriers as to be able to handle the 42 F-35s that they're buying, a maritime version. And in other ways, it's clear Japan is moving forward rather than standing still. Thank you. Next. So we are mutually dependent. That is, the U.S. is mutually dependent on Taiwan with China, but with a big difference. And basically, U.S. companies design all of the leading edge chips, and they are all produced by Taiwan under contract production by the CSMC. Sorry. And China, however, is the largest importer of integrated circuits. So we're talking about 350 billion in 2020. It's because of COVID and the aftermath. It's not clear exactly what the number would be now, but China is still relatively a minor factor in the global semiconductor ecosystem. It can only fabricate 10 at the most 10%, 6 to most at the most 10% of its own needs, and it depends on Taiwan to fabricate 70% of the total, so-called, which becomes Taiwan's so-called silicon shield, because an attack on Taiwan by China means the collapse of its whole economy, really, among other things. Next, please. So this is illustrative of, again, the fact that we're both dependent on China, but it's not the same. So the U.S., for instance, U.S. companies have 47% of global revenue in market share, and China's down there at 5%. It's not that China isn't making strides in the semiconductor industry, but it's at the peripheral level and also to a certain extent in chip design. But when it comes to being able to fabricate chips, they're way behind. Next, please. So this is a different way of looking at the same issue, and it shows how it adds in the fact that the industry is very not only globalized, but it's very broken down into specific functions, specific steps that have to be made to make a semiconductor chip. And you see here, Taiwan has roughly almost 2/3 of the business, and in Taiwan, TSMC is the most important client for the U.S. Partner, really. So in China here, we just have the SMIC is China's main state-owned foundry company. That is, it does fabrication as well as design. But it's you know, it's a very narrow slice of this pie. Next. Oh, I should mention Samsung also. So there are only three countries that can do advanced semiconductors, and the U.S. we can do it, but we only do about 12% of our needs, whereas it used to be more than 30%. Taiwan and TSMC has the lion's share of chip production for leading edge chips, and then Samsung is second. So actually, in terms of importance of fabrication, it's Taiwan, Samsung, South Korea, and the U.S. trailing. Next, please. So I have looked into, well, why does China have such a laggard status, particularly because all we hear all the time is that China is gaining on us everywhere we look in technology and sophisticated, as well as sophisticated weapon systems, et cetera. But there's a reason, historical reason for this, and also a policy reason. And I would just say that the reality is that, when Santa Clara Valley was named Silicon Valley in 1972, China was in the throes of Mao's Cultural Revolution. Their investment in Deng Xiaoping's reforms and their opening to foreign investment led to overdependence, both legal and illegal, on commercializing foreign technology, and that was basically their edge was, or their advantage, export advantage was foreign technology, foreign investment, low wages, cheap land, and large scale infrastructure. They've never put enough into pure science and technology research, and the dominant role of inefficient state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and massive political corruption are preventing them from moving ahead in a way that they need to. They're not really catching up when it comes to leading edge chips, and there are reasons for that. And also these reforms, there were reforms at the time that China joined the WTO and after, and they were going towards a market socialism or capitalism with the Chinese face, et cetera. But this was all undone by this is an error here, it's 2008 global financial crisis that forced China to use heavy doses of pump priming, if you will, to keep the economy floating. And if we know, that among other parts of the government, and is one part of the the GDP equation, and so in that case, their government spending on infrastructure in particular just really wiped out all the progress that they had made towards reform. And of course, now under Xi Jinping is a even bigger reversal from the idea that Deng Xiaoping started, or Zhu Rongji's management of the economy in the past. Next, please. I won't dwell on this, but you can see all the ways that the Biden administration has been forging an all-of-government approach to China and supply chain vulnerability. It is a carryover in many respects from the Trump administration policy, but as we all know, I hope we all know that it's a much more nuanced approach. And and much deeper and broader. And latest being the the new controls on Chinese U.S. dual citizen working for Chinese companies on leading edge technology, AI, nuclear weapons and systems, nuclear and weapon systems. This is a very controversial issue right now because it has to do with, the rights of American citizens, whether they're dual citizens or not. Next, please. So the issue on the supply chain side is, about reshoring or onshoring and how that can come about. And there's some disconnects in this in the administration's approach. And one of them is that while the most important chips to American companies that they produce, design and have produced in Taiwan are leading edge. But in fact, leading edge chips were not the biggest problem during the COVID crisis or even now. The biggest problem had to do with so-called mature chips, almost in many cases, almost commodity chips that simply weren't being produced and shipped during the COVID crisis. So the new foundries that the U.S. is helping to support, including foundries in Arizona by TSMC and Samsung in Texas, or other new foundries that Intel is setting up in Ohio and Washington State, and elsewhere. They're all still focused on leading edge chips, and in fact, that seemed to be U.S. policy, is because we're concerned about maintaining our technological leadership. But meanwhile, we're not really solving the supply chain problem for the most used chips, and the ones whose absence is shut down automobile assemblies and factories, other factories around the world, including definitely the U.S. Next, please. So there are many issues and risks related to export controls, and again, try to summarize these, but the most immediate thing we realize now, or we know now, is a slowdown in demand for chips, and so crashing stock prices for American chip companies. And so the question is, what is the future of the plans of TSMC and Samsung, for instance, and Intel for these new foundries that they're building? Is this going to take the props out? This fall in demand going to knock the props out of that whole process? And the other is that U.S. companies are losing sales of chips to China, although that seems to be overstated, because China never was a big purchaser of leading edge chips from the U.S. And also Qualcomm, for instance, has gotten authority to export near advanced 4G chips, even though it can't export 5G chips to Huawei, the main victim of U.S. policy. But at the same time, these chips are not replaceable by China because of the critical factor that there's only one process that can make a leading edge chips, that is something be below 10 nanometers, down to 10. Now they're down to 5 and even 2 at TSMC in Taiwan. And those machines are made by this Netherlands company, ASML, and Japan also supplies various parts and components to machines that make chips, and Japan is still partly in the more traditional photolithography process for designing and making chips. Next, please. Oh, the other point is that these sanctions will not prevent Chinese military modernization, which is ongoing. But the big issue is it will earn the enmity of China and deny Xi Jinping his Chinese dream of technological parity across the board with the U.S. by 2049. And so my final comment, is hopefully somebody in the administration is working on this issue, because we've gone down a certain road of building a wall against China's acquisition of the machinery in particular to make leading edge chips. And there's no way that China can do this itself. We can talk about that if you have questions about it, but China cannot get access to this extreme ultraviolet photolithography process in these Dutch machines, and without it, there's no other way to get below, say, 10 nanometers in a fully fledged semiconductor chip. So this, I think, is a good place to start or stop and start the Q&A, because it's this is the one question that nobody's really talking about, at least publicly. How long can we keep a wall against China's acquisition of leading edge technology, which then jeopardizes their progress in AI and in automated vehicles, self-driving vehicles, and other, and as well as military technology. So thank you very much for your interest and your presence and your ears, and I look forward to discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cronin. Let me go ahead and adjust the screen view. All right, thank you again. And to our audience members, feel free to start sending your questions to questions-Mariah Yeager, and we will go ahead and address those. All right, let's start with a question from SMA's director, Todd Beasy. This question is, how do these advanced chips factor into the CCP's military capabilities, capacity, and modernization? You said that these export controls and other tools wouldn't slow them down. How did you come to that assessment? Because it seems a little bit counterintuitive.
Yeah, this is a very good question. It's known now that some of China's most advanced weapon systems, including these ultra fast cruise missiles, probably have U.S. chips in them, U.S. leading edge chips in them, or even other U.S. designed chips, the more mature variety. So just thinking about this issue, it's probably for the purpose of leading edge chips for ultra modern military hardware. It's quite likely that China will find a way surreptitiously to obtain the chips it needs, but what it can obtain again is the machinery to actually make chips for itself. And so their limit now is they're limited in how fast that they can modernize and how fast and whether they can keep up with the US.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cronin. Larry Kuznar has asked if you can elaborate on what choke points, quote unquote, might make Chinese capture of Taiwan's chip industry impossible.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, so go back, again, this is, we're talking about a global ecosystem, and of which China is still a minor part. But the point is that there are chemicals, there are the fabrication of chips themselves, there are parts and components to these EUV photolithography machines. There's so many hundreds really of inputs, most of which no country has enough ecosystem to run these ASML machines without drawing widely from the world. Japan, for instance, is a major supplier of chemicals and other technology. The lenses for these machines come from Zeiss in Germany. So it's and right now the machines that Taiwan has, and of which they have about half of all the machine in existence right now. We're talking about 50 or 60 machines. They only can work with a huge contingent of ASML technicians on the spot to both set these machines up and also to keep them running. And so it's that's I think is the main thing. We could not do all this ourselves. We have to depend on the rest of the world.
Right. All right, thank you.
Mhm.
Mike Fritz asks, defensive export control measures temporarily delay an adversary. Can you comment on offensive measures like R&D, which might help the US maintain its lead?
Yes, well, again, if we're talking about leading edge technology and leading edge chips, the US is still dependent on Taiwan for the chips that our companies design. And in addition, this process of ever smaller, faster, more efficient chips has pretty much reached its limit right now at about 2 nanometers between billions of transistors on one chip. It blows the mind to understand that the distance between rows of transistors on a chip is only a few molecules, few water molecules deep, wide. So our engineers and Koreans and the Dutch and with ASML, they're all trying to find a new way to keep this process of ever smaller, faster, more efficient chips going. But and the Chinese have this idea that they talk about the idea they may leapfrog, right, with some new process, but they're so far behind in R&D and the basics that they would need to do this that that's very unlikely. So even though we're running out of running room for miniaturization, et cetera, the US and its allies have so much more research and brain power and technical capabilities going for them that we will still, there'll be a way. We'll still be moving ahead, and China will be falling probably further behind. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
So if I just add that as I mentioned in my presentation, that it's not to say that China will not have a formidable military, and it's not to say that that you need your leading edge ships to blow things up. So you can't just say that they can't leading edge ships. They're not going to be a rival. But for all the things that they're focused on for the future, like for instance, like AI, artificial intelligence, where they're strong in data. They have lots of data because they have all those cameras all over China, and they're very into keeping being aware of everything that everybody's doing. But so it comes with lots of data, but they don't have the computer power to reach their goals right now. And so we don't have as much data, but we have the technology to keep moving ahead with again leading edge kind of chips.
Okay, thank you. An anonymous person asked, the actions that you've mentioned would seem to herd the CCP into rapidly developing an organic chip manufacturing industrial base. This would require industrial espionage and coercion to gain these technologies. What measures is the US taking to limit its exposure to Chinese efforts to obtain industrial secrets required for chip manufacturing?
Yeah, well, one of the main ones is a recent announcement of constraints on dual U.S. Chinese U.S. citizens working for Chinese companies. Taiwan, Korea, and the U.S. are all cracking down on, well, particularly Taiwan and Korea are cracking down on brain drain of technical people being hired by the Chinese to come and work in their factories. But as pointed out, in China right now, both Taiwan and TSMC and Samsung have factories in China making mature chips that together they make more chips in China than the Chinese company than SMIC can produce. So they make about each of them make about 15% of China's annual need of chips. And by the way, China's need for chips is dominated by the fact that they have the world's largest electronic assembly industry. Think Apple, but other Samsung, other international companies are having electronic stuff made in China, in Chinese factories. And the dominant factory company is Foxconn, which is the second biggest Taiwan company. And so, for instance, Foxconn makes half of all the iPhones in China, like something 500,000 a day, some fantastic number of how many they churn out. Now they've got a problem now because of COVID, and we've all read about that, I think. But also China's vehicle industry, which is the largest motor vehicles, largest in the world. Also, we know now they need hundreds of chips at a minimum for these automobiles. So China's imports more chips value-wise than it does oil, and the reason is that it's really a lot of it's in and out. So chips are brought in, they're used in these factories, mainly foreign-owned factories or foreign-run factories, and then exported as exports, either or sold to the domestic economy. So it's a churn there in terms of their massive need for chips.
Mhm. So E. Lee asks, why is Taiwan not freezing the export of semiconductors to China due to its military intrusions into the ADIZ, or the Air Defense Identification Zone?
Yeah.
Could cutting off the supply have have China view this as a pretext to take military action towards Taiwan?
No, I think that's all a kind of a misguided way of looking at the issue. For one thing, China and Taiwan are not quite as a dagger's edge as seems from rhetoric and from sort of China's military buildup, etc. So I'm sorry. Sorry, I should take care of that because it's mutually profitable for both countries and the companies involved to have this trade going on, and so China actually has more equity in Taiwan, and Taiwan has more equity in China than is apparent by what we think. I'm sorry, I got to. I should have taken care of that. Let me turn my phone off. Excuse me. All right. Sorry. So it's much more complicated than that, and so Taiwan wouldn't stop selling chips to China because TSMC, a major part of its profit comes from selling chips to China, and China can't, attacking Taiwan for not selling chips would not gain Chinese control of the process of chip making process. So it just, again, it goes back to this idea of a global ecology of companies and processes and chemicals and all the things that go into this industry. I hope that's clear, but it just and the other thing is that you could say these particularly these EUV photolithography machines, they don't bounce very well. So using military force to try to capture that industry is a non-starter.
All right, thank you. Yeah, that made sense to me. So you had mentioned, I think 2 answers ago, South Korea, and Christopher Twomey brings up the possibility of the U.S. utilizing allies. So the question is if you can characterize the willingness of allies such as South Korea and the Netherlands to support a major strategic or systematic embargo of key technologies alongside the U.S.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think the answer is at least twofold. One is that just the fact of the alliance system and our allies, in particular, respect for U.S. patents and intellectual property, and so and globally, apparently, the U.S. controls about 80% of all the intellectual property regarding in this high tech industry, and even ASML, the Dutch company that makes these exclusive machines that can make leading edge chips. For a long time, Intel was an investor, and in the past, U.S. government has also funded research that went into the machines that the ASML were building, and they're really the machines themselves draw from the whole ecosystem. It just that the brains and the capital has been put in to the process in the Netherlands, but it's so. But in the longer term, yes, I mean, there's I guess the way to look at it is under current circumstances, it looks like our allies will follow our lead on this. But, down the road, this being a strategic industry could have other, geopolitical implications in terms of what happens to the alliance system, and to what extent is it dependent on a total mutually beneficial relationship, or is at some point they're going to say, wait a minute, the U.S. is torquing us a little bit here too much, that we have to rethink our whole situation.
So while we're on the topic of alliances, an anonymous person had asked us a similar question to the one that we were just discussing, but they specifically asked if Africa may have a part to play in the relationship with the U.S. potentially using its allies for a greater opportunity.
I think Africa is part of the picture, mainly in terms of minerals, and certainly not technology. And as you know, China has made a big play for minerals in Africa. But so far, I think the ones that are mined in Africa are African countries are not so relevant to the particular materials and chemicals that are required for semiconductors. Bigger factor is Ukraine and Russia, for instance, in terms of lithium and other things that they make. They dominate.
All right, thank you.
So I understand the concern about China in Africa, but it seems to be very traditionally oriented towards SOE companies, big companies making money through investment or loans more often to the setup of infrastructure projects and mining projects and that sort of thing. That's sort of not that contemporary as regards our subject.
Yeah, I suspect that was what the questioner was getting at, was the sort of minerals that are necessary or materials necessary to create the chips.
Yeah.
So this question was lurking in the back of my head. So I'm glad that Kirk McConnell brought it up. So this question is, you stated that Congress and other players are sort of oblivious to the Taiwan/TSMC problem.
Right.
But he argues that this isn't true. He says that it used to be a problem, but the US government woke up to the problem over the past 3 years or so. And that was a factor in creating the CHIPS Act, which just recently came out.
Yeah.
So he asked if you could clarify perhaps what you think that the US government still isn't quite computing.
Actually, at the executive branch, I think that's true. However, it was only less than a year ago when in Congress, for instance, there was a bipartisan move to exclude to exclude the application of the War Powers Act to a Chinese attack on Taiwan, and it was like went under the rubric of free Biden's hands. It's an irrelevant thing. It's just a misunderstanding of the situation because Taiwan is not an ally, and so the War Powers Act is more complicated that way. And in any event, the administration has 30 days to do whatever it's going to do, and then go back to Congress to get validation, so approval. So yeah, I think the reality is that everybody, the reality is that China knows an attack on Taiwan means a regional, if not a world war, because the impact on, just think of it, COVID was bad enough for supply chains. What happens to our chips if there's a Chinese attack on Taiwan, and what happens to their chips? It's being oversimplified, I think, termed as a military or security problem. It's a real problem, but it's like, again, why would they do that? And really, the only reason that China would be moved to invade Taiwan under present circumstances is if the circumstances are no longer present. That is, if a move by Taiwan towards independence or a push by the U.S. In that direction would then cause China to rethink, whether they needed and when they needed to use force to achieve their ultimate goal. But if you read Xi Jinping's 2-hour speech or whatever it was in the meeting, the party meeting a month ago, he never really reformulates the Chinese line forever, which is we seek peaceful reunion with Taiwan, but we always reserve the right to use force if necessary. And the fact is that circumstances, especially including the so-called Silicon Shield that Taiwan has, those circumstances aren't coming along. And in addition, Xi has got a bushel full of problems with the economy. The growth model isn't working anymore. The huge problems of bad loans and property bubble, and it's still the top-down way that she's trying to operate is not working. It doesn't on semiconductors, for instance. Starting in 2014 and 2015, the Chinese created the so-called Big Fund, which has billions of US dollars equivalents to it. And so it's basically was it set up to fund research on semiconductors by Chinese companies. And one of the things that happened is that now there are many more. Every Chinese company that has a possible benefit is now putting semiconductor in their name, and so the money has gone to thousands, more than 1,000 companies. So it's just scattered. And then with the Big Fund, at least 6 or 7 of the CEOs of this fund have been either arrested or fired for corruption. So it's I wouldn't want to change. I wouldn't want to change places with the Chinese on this.
All right, thank you for those comments, Dr. Cronin. I think that overall the sort of sentiment that Kirk McConnell was getting at with this question was mostly just that, especially within the past several months, I think it was 3 months or so, that the U.S. government has taken more steps towards the U.S. becoming sort of less reliant on on Taiwanese and Chinese chips.
Yes, it's true, and decoupling is, to the extent that it can happen, is increasing. It's just that the bigger problem is simply that China has the scale and the infrastructure for massive production of whatever, so yes, we're moving stuff to Vietnam, to Malaysia, even Mexico. Parts of the process, parts of the high technology investment, but it's and that's the future. I think the future is, several years ago, the Japanese and the U.S. companies started with China Plus One, and we'll keep investing in China, but we're also going to invest to other countries, but on a smaller scale. That's still moving in a way towards ultimately decoupling. But how long that would take, how far it would go is, I think, is anybody's guess right now. Remember that U.S. companies, they're making business decisions, and the whole reason why the foundry business went offshore was simply that it was more efficient and it was cheaper, and because Taiwan, of its own volition, set up a sort of their own Silicon Valley, well, 3 of them now, but in China, and initially to attract Taiwanese educated graduates from U.S. universities, particularly the PhDs and whatnot, to come back to Taiwan when it was still at the end of its authoritarian phase. And so they were set up this campus, and that I actually visited 1988, and they explained what they were trying to do, which there's a guy named Morris Chang who started the TSMC company, who had an American degree and worked for Texas Instruments for many years before he came back to Taiwan. He got all of this started, and so over time, Taiwan now has honed its capabilities and its the integrated nature of its role as a contract producer for U.S. companies as an exclusive. And so TSMC also decided not to get into the design business or to other parts of the business, because that would raise questions about, are they competing with us, or are they, if we have them make our chips, are they going to start competing with us? And so far that hasn't happened. That the bargain has been kept very, very tightly. And so again, that's on paper, it looks like we and China are both dependent on Taiwan, but it's a very, very different setup. And the U.S. dependence is just in the case there was an attack or a war in Asia, but then that doesn't benefit China. China's in a fix as well. So. But I do give I do give the credit to the Biden administration, and even in this issue of debate about strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity, it went up all the way to the Kurt Campbell level, and that's all. That's as far as it went. So that's not, they're not going to be, probably will not be such a declaration. That's certainly not in the cards right now. In other words, it's a much more sophisticated approach to the problem, and it is all of government.
Well, Dr. Cronin, thank you so much for addressing our audience's questions today and for presenting your insights. We had a few questions that we weren't able to address today. So thank you to our audience for submitting so many questions that we ran out of time to address them. If you'd like for your question to still be addressed by Dr. Cronin offline, please send me an email. My email is npeterson@nsidteam.com, and I'd be happy to pass them along to Dr. Cronin.
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that, and I do appreciate all the questions, and they've all been very well focused, I think, on this core issue. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and have a great day.